Thank you for joining me for the last in this four-part series of leadership in times of crisis. If this is the first session you're attending, welcome. If you've attended the other three, welcome to you as well. If you want to see some of the others, you can go to the Qualigence.com website or the steveloes.com website. There's a link there that'll take you to the Leadership in Crisis series. We're going to continue on this whole idea of what do we do during crisis, but it's really going to be a little bit more of the economic side of things, surviving in an economic downturn, and what are some of the things specifically that we've done to do that, but then to set us up for success in the future. So if you didn't join number one, let me just mention in webinar number one, we talked about decisions in times of crisis. And if you remember, all of the sessions have been based upon my own experience, what I did wrong in 2008 and 2009, what I learned from that, and how I've applied things differently now in 2020. So I shared with the way I made decisions in 2009 and now the way we made decisions in terms of this crisis. The second webinar, we talked about the communication in times of crisis, how to communicate, tools to communicate, how often, and especially what information to communicate. And then last week, we talked about, look, everybody's at home. Within 48 hours, in our case, we made the call for people to be working at home because of the quarantine mandate here in the state of Michigan and elsewhere. And what do we as leaders need to understand about kind of the emotional impact on our teams, and what do we need to do as leaders to engage our teams because of some of those emotional impacts. In this case, the name of the webinar was titled Leadership After the Pandemic, or so there's two versions out there actually, Planning for Leadership After the Pandemic. But here's the thing that I wanted to get across, and I'm going to give you a couple of pieces and bits of conversations I've had with others. As leaders, no matter what role you're in fact, I would say anybody, whether you're leading people or you're in an organization without leading people, but you're still influencing people, we cannot wait till the pandemic is done to start leading. So the title's kind of get you to think about it a little bit. Leadership after the pandemic, or again, planning for leadership after the pandemic. Real leadership, based on my experience at least, happens in the midst of crisis because it's actually easy to lead when things are going well. So I remember back in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, sitting in my office. I had the TV on, when that whole thing started, the TV in my office was on every day. Of course, social media was going crazy with some of the things that were happening. Everything, and you were probably there, you saw this. Layoffs were increasing, unemployment was going through the roof, not like today. Right? Jobs were just non-existent at the time. The stock market was getting killed, similar to some of the things that are happening right now. And if you were a leader at the time, even if you weren't, you were probably thinking, how am I going to survive? I know I was. I sat in my office and I stewed on all this information that was coming through me through all of these various channels. And what I didn't realize at the time is that it created this perspective of fear. And a little bit of healthy fear is not a bad thing. Look, what's going on right now, there's some healthy fear in this, and probably some non-healthy fear. But I had created an environment of fear. My mindset and the decisions I made were based on fear. I had created an environment where my team was constantly in fear because of basically what I was putting into my head. I was in a situation of fear, so I created an environment of fear. Now, what's that got to do with this leading after the pandemic or leading during the pandemic? There's 3 points that I want to cover today, and this was the big realization that I just came to a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine, Bill, yesterday, and he reiterated some of this, so I had to do a little bit of digging on what he was talking about, and actually I was lockstep with some of the things that he had just heard or learned by another speaker, but it's actually the same thing that I experienced. So point number one in this is how we view things as leaders and as individuals is how we actually do things. Now let me explain where I'm going with this. Over the past couple of weeks, I've had a lot of conversations with other business leaders and entrepreneurs, owners, both here and across the U.S. And I'm sure you've seen it, and you've probably said it, because I know I have, or comments like, I can't wait till things get back to normal. I can't wait till, this, or actually the flip side of that, this is our new normal, right? I either can't wait to return, or we've got to figure out how to deal with where the new normal is right now. And yesterday I was having this conversation. He's a business leader here. He's a CEO of a company. He calls me up to share some of the pain that he's experiencing. And I've shared in previous webinars, and I made it very vocal. I've got to say that I am one of the most fortunate business owners here in southeastern Michigan, because the team I have and what the team did to get us through this pandemic, and still getting us through this pandemic. And he had seen some of these previous videos in this series and was really complaining to me, first of all, I can't get my team to stick up. All right, some folks said they couldn't hear in the beginning. That was my issue. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me get back to this. And so I'm talking to this guy yesterday, and he's complaining about, again, this is the problem when you're trying to do technology and everything else at the same time. Okay, the video at the beginning had no sound. Thank you for that. I'm not sure what I did wrong, to be honest with you. Maybe we can dub it in for the future, but this is the more important piece. So as I'm having this conversation, this other business owner is talking about not being able to get his team to coalesce around, giving up things, giving up compensation. They're pushing back on everything that he's doing. I could tell he was in this really deep, dark place, and it was really about him, not about the team, not about the long-term, where are they going. And it was really, he had this, I can't wait till things get back to normal so I can just get my team to do what they're supposed to do. I can't wait. And this is what I did in 2008 and 2009. But here's what I didn't realize is that the predetermined, or the perspective that I had, given all this junk I was taking in, it's not all junk, it's probably not the best word, but all this information that I'm taking in is actually what affected the way I made decisions, right? I'm taking all this negativity in. He was taking all this negativity in. And the way I made decisions short term, kind of from a place of I don't want to lose everything, which I get, because we were in that position too. But it had an influence on the team. It had an influence on me personally. It influenced the way I made decisions, and ultimately influenced the whole team in the way that we produced or didn't produce back in 2009. Things completely changed this time around. Back then it was the attitude of, I can't wait till it gets back to the way it was. We were a research and recruiting company before, we're going to be a research and recruiting company after. As opposed to really looking at this thing from a completely different angle. Here's the thing. If you really want to lead your company through and after the crisis, you have to first, as a leader, define your own perspective. And I didn't get this. I was taught things like this long ago, and I went back and thought about what I did in 2009 and the way I reacted and the perspective that was going on. And then I looked at 2020 and what are the things that we're hearing right now, right? Here's the number of new pandemic cases every day. It's on 24/7. And the media continues to talk about it. We continue to talk. It's important to understand what's going on. We talk about how many new deaths are occurring, which is so unbelievably unfortunate. We talk about the number of layoffs. All those things that we talked about in 2008 and 2009, we're talking about again now. And if I make all of my decisions based on this view of, I have no control, then all my decisions are going to be very short term. There's really no path forward if that's what I focus on. There's no opportunity. The decisions are going to be focused solely on today and today only. Here's the reality. Fear creates stagnation. People don't follow a leader who kind of stokes the fire of fear. Naturally, as human beings, we either run from pain or we run to pleasure. And this whole emotional connection to running from pain as a leader will have a negative impact on our entire organization. So that perspective that we have will determine what we do as a leader. If our perspective is immediate survival right now, and I know companies are in different positions, you're going to make drastic decisions that may have a negative long-term impact versus a painful short-term decision that has a positive long-term impact. And I'm going to come back to that here in a second. So think about defining your own perspective. So yes, all these negative things are happening, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel right now too, right? We know how to find this virus. We know how to, in some instances, treat it. We didn't run out of ventilators like we thought we were going to. The communities, the healthcare and non-healthcare communities have come together. I mean, it's kind of like what happened after 9/11. People are coming together to help each other like never before. If we focus on some of the positive things, it may change our view. It will change the actions we take as leaders. Like, I know right now the whole world feels out of control. It started to get there for me as we started to go through this pandemic. But the approach that I had in looking at some of the changing my perspective from just the negative to changing my perspective to the positive created a certain level of calm in the midst of a lot of anxiety and chaos within the organization here. But I had to actually choose to have that perspective instead of my natural default of what happened in 2008 and 2009. Remember what I said, I think it was in both webinar number 1 and webinar number 2. Crisis doesn't make a leader. Crisis actually shows a leader. But I want to walk you through a process that I went through in 2009 that I had to think about how to get out of. Because this idea of perspective drives our decisions, perspective drives our actions, is so true. And it's a model that I've used ever since 2009. I forget about it often, but I want to bring it up, and it's what I call the drift and the shift. You know, before the pandemic hit, so if you think about the end of February into beginning of March, the economy was doing great. As a business, we were doing incredibly well. We had a complete 3-year strategy. We knew where we wanted to go this year. We knew where we wanted to be at the end of the year and so forth. And then obviously, so we were on status quo, but we were kind of growing. It wasn't just status quo, it was good. But what happened? The coronavirus completely upset everything. So there was a circumstance that happened. We're going along. All of a sudden, there's chaos and crisis, right? The pandemic hits. There's a trigger. That was basically the trigger of all the stuff that's happening around us. And this is the same thing that happened in 2009. The financial markets crashed. That was that trigger. We were doing just fine, growing quickly, actually. The trigger happens. And then we start free falling into what I call this drift. The perspective changes. We start making decisions based upon the negative perspective, and we continue down this drift, and we continue all the way down to, because it rhymes with it, the bottom barrel is called the pit, right? Things get really, really bad. You don't want to get up and even do anything anymore. You feel helpless. You feel out of control. And I felt a lot of that in 2009, and it affected my interaction with my team and so on. But then things got a little bit better, and you start coming out of the pit. So think about this as a circle, right? Status quo, things are going just fine. Trigger happens. You start coming down in this drift. You hit bottom, hopefully not too badly. You hit the pit, and then all of a sudden, things start to get a little bit better, and you have what I call a lift. And in many instances, it's this idea of a false lift. Because all we're doing when we're in this, it's like the hamster on the wheel. You're running, but you're getting nowhere. Think about what I'm just describing here and how it relates to this. We start off well, we go all the way to the bottom, we come back, and all we're doing is trying to get back to where we were. How does that drive us for the long term? How is that a perspective that helps us after the pandemic? Because think about it, all we're doing is creating the same wheel over and over and over. But that false lift, things got better, they got back to normal. That creates a mindset in the decisions we make that, again, are very short-term focused, as opposed to thinking, wait a minute here, is there opportunity in the midst of crisis? And I missed this completely in 2008 and 2009. When things are starting to go bad, when things are in a drift, I learned from what I didn't do in 2009 and some of the things that we tried here in 2020, that we can kind of get ourselves out of that drift before we hit the pit and shift out of it and create opportunities in the midst of crisis. Nobody wants a crisis. But I also don't, and I don't think you want to, continue on this hamster on a wheel, repeating the same cycle over and over and over. So how do we get out of that? How do we change our perspective when we're free falling in this idea of the drift? And that's, we have to make a conscious effort to shift, to see where the opportunities are. And this is point number 2. So point number 1 is our perspective, how we think, defines what we do. Number 2 is crisis. We've got to look at it from this perspective. Crisis can create the shift we need to actually lift. So again, I was talking to somebody when I was I had to take a car in for service. It is an essential service here. And I was talking to him on the phone. He mentioned something that I had already experienced and I was getting ready to talk about. He says, crisis can often remove certain boundaries. And I thought, you know what, that really made a lot of sense, because I didn't even think about it when we did this. I had to look back at this. When we got into the crisis that we're in now, we looked at some of the decisions that we were making and saying, okay, let's just do it. We've already got chaos around us to a certain extent, but can we find opportunity in this? Because the boundaries, our risk tolerance basically went up. So this was point number 1 under this. So crisis can create the shift that we need to lift. Point number 1 is risk-taking can increase because the boundaries around us have a tendency to decrease. Let me give you an example, right? When things are bad, things are broken, there's kind of no downside to taking bigger chances, right? The economy sucks. Nobody's hiring. Let's try some new things. Often we revert back to, oh my gosh, how do I just save what I have? Instead of saying, how can we view this as an opportunity so that we're set when the pandemic goes away? And it will, right? This too shall pass. So in this risk-taking, we did a number of things. I don't lower prices here. We decided to cut our prices by 40% to help clients that still had to hire, but were in the same financial predicament that everybody else was. I would have never done that except in the time of crisis. That's kind of a simple one, right? Sometimes we, unfortunately, are on the fence of, let's say, letting somebody go, and crisis creates the opportunity to let somebody go. Never want to do it unless you have to, but it does happen. One of the main thing we did in December and January of this year, we made the determination as an executive team and as an organization, because we got the organization involved, to develop a new structure as we continued to grow to deliver our services to our client. There's kind of some caps in our old structure, and we decided we would gently bring it in stages, a little bit every quarter. So by the end of 2020 or in 2021, we would be ready to go with this new structure. And it made so much sense to the clients. We talked to them about it. They loved it. In the midst of this crisis, we're laying people off. People are getting their salaries cut. The time, their hours are cut in the case of our hourly folks. We made the determination in the midst of that crisis, we already have chaos, to implement a new structure that wasn't going to come out until the end of 2020. And we did it in 48 hours. We already had chaos. The boundaries were off. We made the decision that it was the right thing long term, so that when we get out of the lull of business, we're properly set up for the busyness of business that obviously we hope and we plan on coming back. We did this all in the middle of the crisis because it created opportunities. We're a services business. We decided to look at, are there products that we potentially could provide that help our clients? We stay away from products. Well, that's just not a thing we did, but it opened our eyes to look at things from a different perspective. So we've got to keep that in mind, right? Risks increased, at least for us. The second thing that happened is our focus increased. And I think this is probably the same for everybody. The initial focus was conserving cash, right? We knew that. Actually, even before that, the initial focus was, I got to take my entire team and I got to get them working remote in 24 hours, 48 hours really. And we were all able to focus in on that, get the computers, get the infrastructure, which we mostly had, and get them out into the field within 48 hours. We had focus, we were able to do it. We moved to that new structure that I was talking about, the Qualigence one Qualigence delivery model. We were able to make that happen in 48 hours, something that we were waiting basically 12 months to execute on. So it provided us with the focus to actually get stuff done. But if we as a team hadn't thought about doing that, we would have never accomplished it. And then the third thing that we have found has happened in the midst of this crisis, which has been opportunity, is team members start stepping up. Not necessarily those that are just leaders. Team members that could be leaders started to step up. But here's the thing. I had the same thing happen in 2008 and 9. You probably had it happen in your organization. But as our existing leaders, me in particular, if I wasn't looking for those leaders who were stepping up, I wouldn't have thought about giving them additional responsibility in the midst of crisis. In 2009, my only focus was, oh my gosh, being able to pay payroll. I wasn't looking at all the folks that I had at the time that actually stepped up. This time I found myself, because I had a vision of looking for opportunities, that I started to watch, and as a leadership team, we started to watch who are the team members amongst us, right? They may not even be in a role of leadership who were stepping up, recognizing that. And in fact, during the midst of all of this, in the last 2 weeks, one of our team members was promoted, Jen, who was very open about the pay cuts on LinkedIn and so on. She was promoted to our marketing manager in the middle of this because she stepped up. We've got other members of our recruiting team, of our sales team, of our research team, of our sourcing team that are stepping up, that now we see opportunity for them in the future, because crisis gets people to step up who naturally are capable and able to step up. But if our perspective was all about the short term only, we have to balance these things, we would miss that as leaders and go back to the way we did things and just want things to return back to normal. That's a problem. So that was my number 2 point. My number 3 point, it makes a ton of sense, but I'm going to walk you through the 4 steps that we used this time around, is this idea of short-term thinking creates short-term results. Now, it's easier said than done, but I'm going to walk you through this 4-step process. In 2009, similar to here, my first focus was, how do I save my team? Actually, back in 2009, it was really, how do I save my own ass? It wasn't really on saving my team. This year, it was, how do I save my team? How do I keep my team whole? And so on. How do we create new services? All of those things. I'm pretty much a go with the gut kind of guy. This is just, sometimes it pays off and sometimes it actually hurts, right? In 2009, as I've said in previous webinars, I made decisions behind closed doors. I went with my gut. I came out, I made the decision. That was final. We moved on. In 2020, we made decisions, as I mentioned in webinar 1, in a very different way. But as I thought about it last week in preparation for today's webinar, I thought, what did I do really differently? I did it in the open, all those things, but the actual act of decision making to balance the short term with the long term, to be prepared for the future. What was the process that I actually took to get myself there? And once I realized it, it was quantifiable on what I did. Now, this may not work for you, but let me give you the 4 steps that I took. So as we were thinking about what decisions to make, of course, I had my team come in, but I had to at least have some mindset of my own of where I thought we had to go to create conversation. So the simplest thing in the world, and I didn't do this in 2009, I wrote down each of my solutions, so to speak, each of the decisions that I was going to make. I literally wrote them down because I have a tendency to go with my gut. So when my gut said do this, I wrote down that actual, whatever that decision was. What was the actions that we had to take? This is how I thought about it, and I didn't even realize that I thought about it. You know how when you type up an email where you're really pissed off and you want to hit enter to send it to that person to just, berate them or what have you, and then you walk away from your desk or your computer for a minute and you just have to breathe before you hit enter, right? I know I've in the past knocked off one of those emails, didn't stop, hit enter, boom, it got to that person and created just a worse scenario. It's the same thing that I started to do this time with making some of these decisions. I wrote them down. I think we need to do X. Wrote it down, walked away from it for a short period of time, came back and started to rationalize my own decisions because it's just not natural for me. And I was telling this to another guy gal yesterday that is an SVP of Human Resources for an organization, and it sounds so simple. She's like, well, I kind of think about it. And I encouraged her to write it down, and she called me late last night, and she said, I completely changed the decision I'm going to make because I wrote it down. Seems simple, but it's true. That was step number one. Step number two, so one, write it. Step number two is test it. This is where I had to get two different perspectives, and I can't encourage you enough as a leader to do this. The decisions that I wanted to make or thought we should make after I wrote them down, came back, viewed them again, I shared them with two different groups. One was the internal group, my leadership team, because as the owner, I have a different perspective than they do. The second thing I did is I shared those decisions with somebody outside of the organization. Luckily, I have a group of a few individuals that have been in business a long time, that I went to them specifically for them to poke holes in the decision I was making to make sure it wasn't just a short-term gut reaction, but it was a long-term decision. It was something that would last, but would get us through the short term. So I was able to have outsiders be more objective, and even my team who is living it, they're going to be even more objective than me as the leader because of the impact. So number one, write it down. Number two, it was actually to test it. Number three was unique to me. Number three is what I call challenge it. When we were done making these decisions or have decided this is the direction we're going to go, what I decided to do was take the exact opposite perspective. So we decided to cut salaries of this particular group. Basically, it was like sitting, there's a table here in front of me. I got on the other side of the table and wrote down, what if we don't do this? What's going to happen? And then I looked at, well, what if we do it a little bit differently, an alternative, and what's going to happen? Then I went on the other side, and it was the opposite of that alternative. So in essence, I had the decision I was going to make, the exact opposite decision, writing that down and what the impact was, and two alternate decisions. So in essence, I had four options, but I did it in that pattern. Exact opposite, does that get me what I want? Exact difference, does that get me what I want? Exact opposite of that difference, does it get me what I want? And I had four conclusions. Here's the interesting thing. And I thought we had made some great initial decisions. Going through that process around the table to say, here's the option I would have never thought of, especially the opposite. Here's the impact it would have. In two particular situations, I chose the opposite of the original decision because I hadn't even thought about it. You would think it would be, do you do it or do you not? That's one way to look at it, but if you do it, here's what you have to do, and here's the potential response or the potential reaction. If I do exactly the opposite, thinking through all of that again, I have to do X, and here's the response. Actually writing that down and then challenging it by going all the way around the table, if you want to call it, that was my ability, or that was what caused us to make some of the decisions that in retrospect were actually very good decisions and helped us get through this. And then the last thing is reframe it. So I've got write it, test it, challenge it, and reframe it. Here's what we're afraid of as leaders, at least I was, and I've referenced this once before in 2009. I had this conversation. I've been having a lot of conversations with business leaders. I've had this conversation here in the last couple of days. Think about it in the political world, and I may have mentioned this before. You make a decision in the political world. If you decide to change your stance based on additional information that's coming in, you get clobbered in the political world. As a CEO or as a business leader, as an HR leader, as anybody who's a leader, you need to be able to reframe your decisions based on new information that's coming in. So decision A is this, now I've uncovered this. It may not have been technically new information, but it was new information to me or my leadership team. Now we've got to change course and make a different decision. So we're constantly reframing, because if we stick with that decision, which we naturally want to do as human beings, that's very short-sighted. We have to reframe with the changes in what's going on around us so that we're making decisions with a long-term view. So we need to lead not after the crisis, we need to be leading through the crisis with a plan and approach that actually gets us to look broader than what's going on today. Look, here's the thing. Things may never be the same again. Work at home rules, the economy, retail, things may never be the same again. Focusing on getting back to that sounds logical, but the reality of it is, it's not. No one wants a crisis, but as leaders, we need to be able to find the opportunity actually in crisis. Think about some of these steps that I laid out. They've been helpful to me to get us to where we are today. We're not through this thing, but we're positioned really well with a balance of what do we do to make sure we can survive today, but how do we make that decision that supports the long term, not independent of the long term? And what's our perspective that we're using that's influencing our decisions, that influences your team, the decisions they make, and so forth. You can choose to do it from a point of weakness, or you can choose to do it from a point of clarity, even in the midst of chaos. I hope this has been helpful for some of you. If you take one nugget out of this in the way in which you lead, or want to share this with somebody else, the recording of this will go up sometime tomorrow with the link on the original page. Now, not next week, as I said. The following week, we will begin another series. It's going to be 4 or 5 parts, I don't know. Surviving an Economic Turndown. If you want some free resources now for yourself or to share, if you go to the Qualigence.com website, right on the front now, there's a link that is a crisis toolkit. It's basically a number of free things. It's links to these webinars, future ones we're going to be doing. Next week, I believe my son Stephen is going to be doing one about working from home, much more in depth than what I did. We've got a number of other freebies. If you happen to be in the talent acquisition space, there's free links to free training there. If you're in leadership, stay tuned with these webinars. There's all kinds of things that I think that is our responsibility to give back. And if I've learned something, I'd rather not have somebody else make the same mistake. So thank you for being a part of this. Any thoughts, any comments, please reach out to me directly. Stay healthy, take care of yourself, keep your social distancing so we keep this pandemic down, and hopefully at some point in the near future we'll see you and we'll meet in person. Thanks so much, everybody.